So Paul Davis, of course, needs no introduction, but just in case someone doesn't know him yet, he's one of the really big figures in Linux audio. He's known for Jack, of course, and also for the Ardor digital audio workstation software. And he also has some thoughts on open source and how to turn it also into business, and but still keep to the open source ideal. So without any further ado, this is the keynote by Paul Davis, 20 years of open source audio, success, failure, and the in-between.
Thank you very much, Albert. So I'm going to apologize first of all, but because I think a number of people might find this a little bit of a pessimistic, maybe slightly negative talk. Which is not really my intent. I'm just thinking of it as realistic. So what I want to try to talk about is I'm going to start just doing a very, very quick overview of where open source audio software was prior to the late 1990s, which is 20 years ago. I want to talk a bit about the process of creating software and what role open source plays in that, because obviously open source is one way of creating software. It's a technique that many of us in the room use and love. It's not the only way. And then I want to talk about some of the successes, and I want to talk more about the failures. And then I want to talk a little bit about what the future might hold, at least in respect to things that are connected with open source. So I started working on open source audio software in the late 1990s, and that's already significantly after the whole free software movement started, which was, many of us know, was started by Richard Stallman at MIT in the early 1980s. There was open source software floating around going back to the 1950s, long before Stallman got involved in this, and probably the first example of that would have been Music 1, the original language used by Max Matthews to synthesize sound on a computer. It wasn't open because there was a philosophy of open source software. It was open because the kind of hardware they worked on, there was only open source. There was no other way to have anything. You had to look at the source. There was no real other version of the program. By 1967, 10 years later, the world had changed dramatically, or the computing world obviously changed very dramatically. Max Matthews had the foresight to understand what the implications of open source, although obviously he wouldn't have known the term back then, and he wanted Music 5, which was the fifth iteration of the language that he had started, to be open. There are some interesting feed forwards from that. Obviously C Sound, Pure Data, SuperCollider, these are all languages that have carried on the so-called Music N tradition, and although SuperCollider started as a closed source thing, these have all ended up being open source programs that are now widely used. I thought it was interesting, in 1981 there was an album by Synergy that came out that had the assembler for the whole, that was used to compose all the music on the album, printed on the back of the album. It was for a PDP-11. I'm not sure if anybody ever tried to write it down, but technically open source as well. Now today, of course, the Music N tradition has also given us some proprietary software in the form of things like Max and Reactor, that although they may not look like any of the Music N languages, they're clearly related to that same heritage. A little bit later than the work that Max Matthews was doing in the late 60s and early 70s, we started to see some other changes going on with computers and audio. Of course, the Commodore 64 and the Atari, which were the first easily available computers that had some sort of sound chip in them and a MIDI port. That led to people to actually start to write closed source software. These machines came out after the Bill Gates letter of whenever that was, that argued that things ought to be closed. And so there started to actually be quite a lot of closed source software to let you do MIDI sequencing. There were also quite a lot of people at that time who were writing software for these machines that didn't write closed source software, and there's a whole genre now that we tend to retrospectively call chiptunes, It wasn't called that back in the beginning, but there were people sharing source code and sharing ideas and sharing ways of making sound on these early personal computers. By 1990, the personal computers that you could easily buy were capable of doing real-time audio. And that started to change things very dramatically for all of us, obviously. In the early 1990s, when NEC started their famous black cube computer, one of the big selling points of it that they used in marketing was it has a Motorola DSP chip in it and a MIDI port, and it runs Unix. So things were clearly shifting towards the idea that doing this kind of stuff on somewhat ordinary, relatively small computers was going to be some big part of the future. Again, in the early 90s, we also had the rise of these DSP cards. Although computers could do real-time audio at that point, they couldn't really do very much. So you could buy a NeXT machine, or you could even buy a Commodore 64, and obviously make some sounds on it. But if you wanted to actually write some multi-track system, you probably weren't going to be able to do that with the CPU installed on the machine. So companies like DigiDesign could see this very clearly and built hardware systems that let them do all the signal processing on a DSP farm that was plugged into the PCI bus. The other big thing that happened, of course, in the early 1990s was the emergence of plug-in APIs. I think DigiDesign were the first people to create this because they were the first people that had a system really capable of doing high-end audio. But very soon afterwards, Steinberg came out with VST, and there we go. So in 1991, of course, Linux appeared in the world. And just 6 or 7 years later, we already had the open sound system drivers that let us do audio I/O on Linux. We already had ports of C-Sound and JMax at that time. There are a few programs floating around that at least looked like they were capable of being used to make music and be engaged in sort of creative workflows and stuff. There was a program called Multitrack. It was the first one that I ever tried using on Linux. It was the main reason I decided I could use Linux for audio, actually. And it was complete garbage. It just couldn't do even remotely what it claimed to do. Rose Garden had actually appeared very early in this process, and obviously it's still with us. It's possibly one of the oldest GUI applications that's sort of still, I don't know if it's widely used, but it's still out there. It's still a very capable program. We also had other things that sort of appeared to be quite popular and had a bright future in front of them at that time, like Art and the eSound Daemon, and there was a sequencer called Jazz++, which some of you might remember. And these things have all just obviously faded away, and we don't really use them or talk about them, and they've really left no mark on the world since their existence. We also had a few drivers for some semi-pro audio interfaces, but most of the audio I/O that people were doing was on some variation of the Sound Blaster, which is one of the earliest sound cards that you could get for Intel personal computers. And it had a whole series of, there were a whole series of clones of the Sound Blaster, so once we had a driver for one of them, then you could use it on other variations. Lots of people were writing software using the so-called push model, where their applications decide how much audio to send out and when, which is one of the biggest problems that we had to deal with and still have to deal with occasionally. And we had no plug-in APIs, of course. So we're in a situation where people were just all writing their own standalone software, doing whatever they felt like doing, and there was really no way for things to interoperate or to interact. And if you wanted to just write a simple DSP algorithm and try it out, there weren't really any hosts that you could load it into. You'd have to write an entire application. And there were, of course, some libraries that would help you do this that appeared quite early on. Things like, names I don't remember anymore, but there were some libraries that would ease the task. You still had to write an entire program. So, brief history. Who is software written for? Some people in the room in here, I'm guessing, don't write software. I'm guessing a big chunk of people who are in here do write software at least some of the time. And some of them probably even write audio software some of the time or even most of the time. And there's a big question when we're writing software for me, which is the question of who are we actually writing software for? Many of us, including myself, when we started doing audio software on Linux, we were writing software for ourselves or for a very narrowly constrained idea of who the users might be. Other people who want to do exactly the same thing that I want to do, or something very close to it. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with writing software that caters to a very well-defined use case, a very small number of people, even a single-use instance. In the talk we had yesterday from Thierry, he talked about a whole bunch of projects that were essentially one-offs. You build something, it gets used, and a variant of it might get used again, but that's pretty much it. But the process for creating software that is highly targeted and has a very small number of users is really different than the one that we use if we're trying to create software that's going to be used by lots of people. There's a tendency in the Linux audio world mostly to create software that can be used by people who already know what they're doing. And again, I want to stress, I don't think that there's anything wrong with this, it's just that we need to keep in mind what the differences are. And something I've talked about possibly even at previous LACs, but it's always a particular bugbear of mine, that I think when we think about computers as tools for creating music, for processing sound, and all the things that we've got some great talks here at the conference and in previous years, and I'm sure in future years, the computers are functioning as tools. And we don't have to go back very far to a point where there were no computers, where there were no general purpose tools at all. Most tools were highly specialized for some particular purpose. And the example I always tend to use is woodworking tools. If you're a woodworker and you use tools, you absolutely expect to have to become an expert in using those tools. You do not sit down in front of a table saw or a router or a bandsaw or any other of the many tools that woodworkers use, even the original hand tools like chisels, and just think that you'll just be able to do something incredible with them. It just doesn't work in that way, and nobody has that expectation. But after 35 or 40 years of computers being somewhat available in the world, most computer users and many musicians don't think about tools in that way. They mostly think that, most people think that computers should be things that you sit down and they'll just help you do what you want to do without you really needing to learn an awful lot about the tool itself. They expect that the tool will guide you through the task, that when you make an error, it'll tell you that you made an error. When there's a way for something to be done much quicker, it will somehow indicate that you can do that. And that's the expectation that an awful lot of people have about computers in general. It doesn't matter whether it's audio software, it could be a spreadsheet, it could be something else. Now, I don't think that this is necessarily a failing. I remember realizing at some point that cameras had been through this process. If you go back before the advent of digital cameras, if you wanted to be a good photographer, you had to understand, no, let me back up. If you wanted to take good photographs, because there's a difference. If you wanted to take good photographs, you needed to really understand how traditional non-digital cameras worked. You need to understand lenses, you needed to understand exposure, you need to understand some of the chemical qualities of film, the whole process of developing and all this stuff. And that was sort of part and parcel of what's it going to take to actually make good pictures. And then digital cameras came along, and initially there was a lot of noise from people and saying, oh, you don't have to understand stuff, which means you can't possibly take good pictures with these things anymore. Now there's loads of people taking really good pictures who don't understand anything about how cameras work. And is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I don't have an answer. What I do know is it's very different than it used to be. And we've obviously seen the same thing happen with many, many other things that computers make possible, including audio. Now, for me personally, my take on who am I writing software for now has changed in the 20 or so years that I've been involved in this. And I would summarize some of what I want to do is I would like to write software that inspires people who are looking for inspiration, not perspiration. A bit of a glib phrase there. The problem is writing good software is hard. It's really, really, really hard. It's crazy hard. What is good software to start with? Well, good software matches your user's expectations. It matches their desired workflow, which is different necessarily than expectations. Expectations more have to do with the outcome. Workflow has to do with how we're going to get from where we are to where we want to be. It needs to match their needs. It needs to match their documentation requirements as well. Many users of many pieces of computer software these days don't expect to read documentation. They expect that software will be self-documenting. Some people want really good manuals that will explain how to do lots and lots of things. And those people are uncomfortable if you violate those expectations. If you tell people you can't use this software unless you read this 200-page manual, some of them will be very upset. Some people, if you tell them there is no manual, they'll be very upset as well. The problem is, these things are all very hard to pin down. What are user expectations? If I went around this room and got 50 different bits of feedback on how do you expect to use a DAW, I'd probably have at least 40 different, well, maybe not 40, perhaps 30 different answers. What's the workflow? I'd probably have at least 50 of those. Some people would have more than one. What are your needs? What are your expectations about documentation? And worse, your expectations now are going to be different than they are 2 years from now. You're going to learn how to use the tools, and in 2 years from now, your expectations of what the tools will do, what you want to do, will change. I can't count, the number of times that we've had users of Ardour who've stuck around for long enough that they go from, why is your program so complicated? All I want to do is record myself sing and play guitar, to why is it now an option to do a multi-trim on these regions and have it all beat synced or something? And you're like, how did that happen? But it happens all the time. So we've got users whose expectations start off being different and then become different in themselves, and all these other things that, we're chasing a moving target here, one that we can't know. So, because of all that, it's really hard to write good software. It's easy to write software, I should say. Really easy to write software, especially today. But writing good software requires really good people, especially in the domain that we all work in, people who know quite a lot compared to some of the people who are able to write software in the modern era. It involves you in a potentially endless feedback loop with users, because if our goal is to meet user expectations and user needs, user workflows, we have to find out more about what they are. And because those things will change for individual users and will change over time. Who did time stretching in 1990? Nobody did time stretching in 1990. Now, do you have a DAW that doesn't do time stretching? No, you do not. It's just a completely basic feature. So, what users want, what users need, what they expect, how they think things should work, you're involved in that feedback loop with them. As their expectations change, your expectations change, as your abilities, either because you learn more or because new software comes out or because CPUs get faster, what you can offer them changes. So there's this potentially endless loop. It involves bug fixing, because we all know software has bugs. Lots and lots of bugs sometimes, and that is a very important component of writing good software. It's very easy to get to a point where you have a piece of software that sort of does 95%, 98% of what you want, or what users want, but that last 2% can be really critical for people, and it can be really hard to close because it gets caused by bugs, not by bad design. Testing is a huge issue. Now, in the open source world, we've sort of delegated testing to our users. We don't hire rooms full of people who sit and try to break software. We just give it out to users who try to break it. And then they report back to us. But that's a very big part of the process of getting to the point where you've got good software. The other thing about writing good software, particularly in the sort of creative zone, artistically oriented software, is that the task is often unending. Ardour is never going to be finished. There might come a point where I'm not working on it anymore, but the program won't ever be finished. It will carry on evolving. There'll carry on being new needs, new requirements, new requests, and the program will just go on and on and on. This is not like writing some small utility or an app for a mobile device that you write it and eventually it's just done. It's got all the functions it needs. It has all the buttons. Maybe they have to upgrade it for some new version of the platform, but it's done. The sort of software that I tend to be interested in these days, which is mostly called Ardour, is unending. So, how does open source fit into this? Well, there's a lot of people in the world that I come across both online and sometimes in person who seem to have this attitude towards open source that it's this magic bullet. I'm just going to write some lines of code and put it on GitHub, and people will come in and they'll contribute to it, and people will write documentation and it'll get extended to this, and oh my God, it's going to be great. No. That isn't going to happen. it's a bit like Kickstarter, right? I mean, almost everything that happens on Kickstarter fails. We all hear about the high profile cases of people doing Kickstarters and they raise lots of money and something good happens, but I think the percentage is 93, 94% of Kickstarters, I think, fail. And open source software projects, maybe the percentage isn't quite as bad as Kickstarters, but it's not far off. Most bits of open source code, if you look across everything, just say on GitHub, most of it is a dead end. It doesn't go anywhere. Now, I say a dead end. It might actually be really useful for the person that initially did the fork or started the library or whatever, but it doesn't make it out to a broader world. It doesn't attract new developers. And one of the reasons why a lot of people get involved with open source is precisely because there's a capability to do that. Now, if you go back to the list I had on the previous slide of, you know, what makes writing good software hard, the problem is open source doesn't really help you with any of the hard things. Hiring or just finding really good people is hard to do. It doesn't really matter whether you're going to pay them or not. Obviously, paying them might help, but not necessarily. Really good people might just show up, but realistically, for lots of things, they probably won't. With bug fixing, yeah, okay, we've distributed out, the code's all available, anyone could come in and fix problems. Probably not going to do that. You also have lots more people able to report bugs and be fully involved in your bug process, which when you look at closed source companies, it's not really quite so true. You can report a bug, there's a tendency to shut users out of what happens after that until there's an announcement that it's fixed. The testing gets distributed, which is great. Now you've got this free workforce of people all busy trying to break your new software, which is great. More testing is better, but it can also be totally chaotic. You haven't hired people who are going to work according to some plan or some particular agenda about what needs testing. They're just people who are trying to use your software and they found that it's broken. So now you've got this sort of chaotic set of reports coming in that you have to manage. And the open source process doesn't help with that. It's making it more difficult. The other big thing is that when you get involved in open source, I mean, for me, one of the big pluses of it is that there tends to be so much more capability to interact with users and directly. But the type of feedback that you get when you do that is qualitatively different. If you look at most proprietary development models, users do not get to talk to developers. There are some very small companies that work in that way, but the moment that there's front-end support and then there are developers, you only get to talk to front-end support if you're a user. And the open source world, it's pretty typical that if you're a user, you'll often get to talk to a developer, possibly the lead developer. And so the type of interactions that happen there are pretty different. And this also makes the development process more challenging rather than easier. Now, that sounds slightly gloomy, but there are benefits to us using open source. Some people will argue that you get better code out of an open source project, and I think that's somewhat true. I know that for me, over all the years of working on Arda, the idea of committing something that I didn't want Robin to see was terrifying. Like, I can't possibly commit that now. Somebody else is going to read it, and they're going to look at it and go, like, what the hell is Paul doing? This is terrible. So there is a sort of a sense in which you try to keep things clean, if you have a conscience at least. And if you don't have a conscience, then we don't want you on our project. But clean code doesn't necessarily mean correct code. And you know, as the history of Arda demonstrates, with abundant examples, in zillions of cases, we've got very nice clean code and it doesn't do the right thing. Assuming that because it's open source, to go back to Linus's famous comment, no, not Linus, I'm sorry, it's Eric Raymond, many eyes make all bugs shallow. Bullshit. What many eyes do is mostly just makes more bug reports or more chatter on IRC. It does not lead to all bugs being fixed. It just doesn't. Yes, it's true that having more people being able to look at code opens up the possibility that more people can contribute to it, and you might get lucky and that there may be somebody out there who is able to actually fix a bug. But as the software that you're working on gets more and more complicated, that's hard. The biggest benefit that we get while working open source, well, I'm going to talk about this more in a couple of slides from now, is libraries. The other thing that we get, of course, is the development infrastructure, which is there for us and is very pliable and and configurable to our needs. The development infrastructure, which includes all the stuff on a developer's machine and all the online stuff that we use. Now, of course, these things, you know, a proprietary company can benefit from too. I'm not sure whether they necessarily can benefit to the same extent that we do. Whoops, sorry, backwards. Do users care about it being open source? Now, I think clearly some people do. I think probably quite a lot of people in this room care about using open source software, and it matters to them that they're using open source software. But I think it's pretty obvious also that many users do not. The problem is we don't really have any way of measuring what the ratio between those two groups is. Personally, my gut feeling is more users don't care. More users view open source as a proxy for low cost. And so it's free software. It's open source, well, that's great, but I like the fact that it's either cheap or free. I could be wrong about that. There's another division in the user community that is important for me in how I think about what I do. There's some people get into making music, and I'm thinking specifically of musicians here rather than, for example, audio engineers or people doing research in acoustics and so on. People get into making music as a way of making a living, and for them, if you provide them with software that speeds stuff up, they have an easier life. They can make more money per hour, or they can work less hours, or they can just have less hassle in general. So I remember a friend of mine who composes music for like TV shows and ads, was super excited some years ago when some new plugin showed up on his Mac that would let him actually ask for, God, what was the thing he put in? He wanted a Latin hip-hop with a Parisian urban feel. Now, you might have to spend quite a long time figuring out what that is if you had to program it all, but RMX Stylus will let you just ask for that. Boom, there it is. I've got to do 30 seconds of this for this spot on the ad. I'm done. Okay? For this person, that type of software is incredible. I mean, it changes, you know, their whole life because they can go out or sleep or whatever else during the time they would have otherwise spent trying to program this descriptive rhythm. But some people get into doing music more as a way of exploring self-expression. And for those people, saving time is not the key thing that they want out of software. They want software that will help them to get from wherever they are to where they want to go. And sometimes, obviously, time is important. If you can get from A to B more quickly, that's going to be slightly more satisfying. But oftentimes, they don't really know where they want to go. They're exploring keys, they're exploring rhythm, they're exploring timbre, they're exploring just the basic idea of the piece. And they want tools that will let them explore these things easily and sort of really get to the heart of whatever inspiration they may or may not have. Now, obviously, these can be the same person. There might be a person who spends their day composing, you know, music for adverts, and in the nighttime they try to create wonderful music that really speaks to who they are and how they see the world. And then, of course, there are some people for whom it's actually the tinkering that is the self-expression. They're not so interested in the aesthetic qualities of what comes out at the end. The actual process of doing stuff and the process by which the audio is created at the end, that's what they're interested in. And so you've got sort of three quite different user groups there, all of which have somewhat different expectations of software. And again, the open source aspect to it really has very little impact on these three groups. I mentioned that, you know, libraries are one of the huge benefits of working in open source. I mean, they're overwhelmingly the largest benefit. You sit down and write a piece of audio software now, then the amount of stuff you don't have to write is incredible. I mean, the range of libraries that you can get and how well they work and what they do, and if you're working in the GPL domain, there's just a ton of this stuff you can just use for free. No licensing arrangements, no phone calls to companies, no anything. It's just there, use it, and do what you want. And there's a lot of it. Ardor, you build a dependency stack, it's 0.5 gigabyte of compiled code. That represents the project's indebtedness to the work that other people have done. It's a huge indebtedness. It represents a huge amount of work in all these different kinds of domains: graphics, networking, disk I/O, you know, all of this stuff. It's just done for us. And this is by far the biggest benefit that I perceive of being part of the open source world. The thing is, this doesn't change the fact you've still got a program to write. And if you want to write a program like Arda, you have to face the fact that even with a half a gigabyte of built libraries, you're still going to have a lot of code. What libraries do not do, and I was talking to Harry about this yesterday with his controller library, our experience in Arda of writing support for control surfaces is that the really hard part is not the interaction with the device, although it's quite nice to have the idea that that will be abstracted and done in some very uniform way regardless of the protocol that the device uses. The hard part is all the semantics of exactly how the software is going to interact with the surface. To use the terms he was using, you know, how you layer and multiplex stuff onto the device. It's application logic, and libraries don't replace that. And so in Arda, we've got 75% of our code is in the GUI. A lot of people come to Arda's code base and they think, oh, you know, the back end that does all the audio stuff, that must be really where all of the complicated stuff is. Well, I mean, there's a few bits of complicated, clever code in libarda, but the really hard part to write generally is the GUI, because that's the bit that interacts with users and has to match workflow and expectations and all that kind of stuff. So even with this incredibly rich set of libraries, you still have to deal with your application's own logic. And it's particularly true for these creative apps, which are just rather different than some other kinds, and we'll talk about that more in a second. There's also the whole question of how do you use open source? There's lots to share. There's all these libraries, and there's all the stuff that everybody in this room, many people in this room have contributed to. How much should we reuse? Obviously, legally, it's really clear. If you put it under the GPL or the LGPL or some other open source license, we know that we can use it, at least most of those licenses. But morally, should we do that? Should we just suck in whole plugins from the rest of the world and just reuse them? I mean, people wrote it as open source. They obviously made a choice to put under that license. Maybe they imagined it'd be useful for other people, or it'd be great if other people did something good with it. Is that an example of doing the right thing? I don't really know. I don't think anybody really knows. I think it's a decision that you almost need to make on a case-by-case basis. It might even depend on who you are versus the developer of the thing that you want to use as. So there aren't simple answers to that. What about if you want to just suck in an entire application and reuse it? Obviously, with libraries, it's much easier because people write libraries with the intention of them being shared. Another issue, actually, I'm going to skip over that slide because it's not that relevant. Now, one thing, I want to make sure I finish on time. So one thing that comes up a lot at this conference from the talks that we see here is a lot of people prototyping stuff. And it's really cool. People especially using tools like Pure Data and so on. It reminds me an awful lot of the Unix shell environment. If you go back to the early 1980s, Koenig and Pite published this book called The Unix Programming Environment, and for me, when it was given to me by my boss, it was a revelation. You know, this environment in which you could sort of play with programming, creating pipes and these commands to chop up bits of text and files. It was incredible. It was so different than anything else I'd seen, and it seemed so powerful. And it is powerful. The only problem is I don't think anybody ever wrote any software that was widely used in the Unix shell. It's a playground for experimenting with ideas and or doing things right now. It's not an environment for creating software that's widely used. And I think a lot of the tools that tend to get spoken about a lot on Linux for doing audio fall into this kind of category. They're excellent at prototyping, and people have lots of fun with them and do really cool things with them, but only for prototyping. In the same way that the Unix shell was really good for prototyping lots of things, and having figured out how to do it, yeah, then you went off and wrote a program, an actual program. So, time stretching, I mentioned it earlier. ZPlane, or ZPlane for the Brits among us, is a small company in Berlin. They were founded, I don't actually know when, probably 12 years ago or so. They wrote a time and pitch shifting engine called Elastique, which is used by almost everyone that exposes that technology to their users in the commercial world. And after they wrote Elastique, they've gone on to write lots of other modules for doing analysis and processing. In open source world, Rubberband, librubberband, is the nearest thing we have to what Elastique does. There are some others. That said, there are some other components that are equivalent to their other modules, but I'm interested only in the time stretch part. Now, Rubberband is really, really great. It's a nice library, has a great API. It's pretty efficient. It sounds better than SoundTouch, that's for sure, on most material. It's not as good as Elastique. Why not? We've known how to do time stretching and pitch shifting for decades. There have been a few interesting new ideas, maybe in the last decade, but we've had a long time to know about it. So the information's out there. Why hasn't the open source world done something just as good as Elastique? That's because it's not just knowing. ZPlane took the initial version of Elastique, which probably wasn't that great, and they polished it, and they polished it, and they polished it for years. It became so good that even Ableton, whose entire claim to fame to some extent when the first version of Live came out was this amazing granular resynthesis engine that was at the heart of everything that they did. They decided, you know what, the ZPlane guys have done this much better, so we'll just switch to using theirs. How can an open source effort ever be this disciplined? Because we don't tend to have this kind of discipline. We have some really cool software floating around. We don't have something that represents a bunch of people spending more than a decade polishing and polishing and polishing. It's not just open source that has this problem. I don't want to suggest that all proprietary companies are successful and all open source attempts to do the same thing will fail. There's a guy, Stefan Bernse, who knows an awful lot about time stretching, and he's written some really good implementations himself that he's tried to commercialize. His stuff hasn't really worked. There's a couple of people that license his stuff, but so it's not just about their closed source, we're open source. There are other factors too. But this notion that some stuff just really takes a huge amount of effort to polish it is something that's very hard for the open source world to do. Why is it hard? Well, one of the reasons is that wanting to spend time writing open source audio software, you have to have some odd motivations, right? Why would you want to do this? It puts you in some tiny fraction of people, and there's not much available to support you in any conventional sense in what you're doing. There's also the problem, there's not very many people who can do this, at least when we get down to the hard problems. For some of the DSP problems that you face with audio software, there might be double digits of people in the world who could possibly write that code for you. And the idea of somehow they're going to come and just do open source stuff for no reason, unless they already do it, is kind of unlikely. And also, just in general, even as an open source programmer, who wants to spend years just polishing up an existing blob of code? It's not very interesting. The only way you normally get people to do this kind of thing is to pay them. So, if we can't write the world's best time stretching module, where do we win? Well, we do win in academic environments where Linux is widely used. I'm not sure it necessarily pushes out the Mac. It probably is even with Windows. It's widely used for compositional research, experiments. Also these days in the data analysis world, the musicology. I was down at UPF in Barcelona a couple of months ago talking to Javier Serra's group, and they're doing all kinds of things with this now. That's all to do with big data, and of course that's all Linux and web servers and all open source stuff. Not open source audio, but open source software. And we win in embedded systems, obviously, all kinds of machines based on small computers, all kinds of things based on big computers called mixing consoles. But in this world, the open source aspect isn't really necessarily that useful for users. If you've got a Studio console that runs Linux, big deal. It's not going to do anything for you. It's just a platform for them to write their code on top of it. So where do we fail? So we do have some fairly interesting tools for these groups of people. And there are people all around the world doing things with Linux audio software, with Linux and with Linux audio software. And they will be derided when they show up on the forums for typical commercial software, but they're still out there and they're still doing things, and it's awesome. We've also built a bunch of really good tools for people that build these tools. I mentioned earlier all the prototyping stuff that we have. Linux is just an amazing playground to cook up ideas and then move forward with trying to actually build quote, real software. I'm not trying to really put down the prototyping stuff, but just that distinction is important. The thing about all these worlds is there tends to be a bit of a lack of distinction between other programmers and users. And again, I don't think this matters, but if you have an interest in trying to reach a large number of people to use your software, recognizing that most of the stuff that we do well works well for people who are sort of half programmer, half user is an important thing to realize. So I wanted to come up with a huge long list of free and open source software that I thought was amazing. And I guess it just speaks to either how old I am or how negative and cynical I am. I couldn't come up with a really long list. I did think of these 4 things that each of them have a very interesting property to me. So the first thing is the USB audio driver. Obviously, it's open source. It's in the kernel. Increasingly these days, you plug any USB class compliant, well, 2.0 class compliant device into a Linux machine, it just works. And we have to thank iOS for this, because manufacturers aren't doing this to make it work on Linux. They're doing it to make it work on iOS. They don't get to write drivers for iOS. They have to use Apple's driver. And so they make it totally class compliant. And over the years, their Linux driver has been iterated, and it's getting really, really good now. You can just plug a Behringer X32 in and get 32 channels of audio over USB 2 straight into a Linux machine without doing anything special. It's incredible. Sonic Visualizer. It's not very widely used. This is an amazing piece of software. And what's mostly amazing about it is that even though there are some other programs that are around that were inspiration for it or that do similar things, what it does was actually not done by anything else. I mean, ARDA is utterly derivative. I looked at Pro Tools and I asked them for the source code and they wouldn't give it to me, so I wrote ARDA. Sonic Visualizer, you know, when Chris and the other people involved in this started it, they weren't saying there's this cool program that's proprietary, we want to write a free one. They actually said, look, we need to do this thing, or we want other people to be able to do this thing, and we're going to write it. And the result is just incredibly impressive. If you've ever seen one of Chris's demonstrations of Sonic Visualizer, particularly the one where he lines up opera from 5 decades and plays them all in the same track and jumps between tracks and everything's in sync, it's an incredible piece of work. Totally cross-platform too. Faust. Faust is something that is like the user base for Faust. I mean, I know that Karma does workshops and I know there's workshops everywhere else. Realistically, the user base for Faust is tiny compared to a lot of things. But it's an incredibly innovative idea. It doesn't come from the proprietary world, certainly not in any clear way. And the guys at GRAME who are working it just keep doing more and more things with it to make it more and more useful. So it's a very interesting piece of software in the sense it has a really small user base in any absolute sense, but has the potential to have lots of knock-on effects, and I think it already is. And then there's Audacity, of course. This is an incredibly ugly program. Most people don't even understand what Audacity is. You get people thinking that it's a DAW or something, which it just isn't. They've made all kinds of mistakes along the way in terms of the internal design of the program and what they expose to users. But guess what? It's used by zillions of people. I would guess probably more than half the podcasts in the world are all done on Audacity. It runs on all platforms. It gets bundled with audio hardware. Phenomenally successful. Whether it deserves it, I don't know, but it has been very successful. Now, can we measure success? Well, it's a little difficult in the open source world. We don't really do marketing, so I'll talk about it in a second. We don't really do sales. So how do we know how many people use our software? Well, you know, you can measure downloads, I guess. ARDA is probably one of the only cases where we actually meter it. We have a pingback system in the versions that we distribute from arda.org. And just those pingbacks alone, somebody starts it once every 2.5 minutes somewhere in the world. But everything else, who knows? I mean, if you look at the statistics for how many people download ARDA versus how many pingbacks we get, it's really, really clear. By the way, when we look at the pingback numbers, compare it to the downloads, it's very clear there's an awful lot of people who fire it up once and never use it again. So does that count as a user? I think not, right? So downloads alone is not a useful statistic. We don't have statistics for how many people are using our software. Things that we've missed on. We have no Ableton Live Bitwig style workflow yet. Whether it's going to come, I don't know. What do we mean by that? People here generally know what I mean. Beat sync, clip launching, all this stuff. We have the Linux audio stack, which I'm going to talk about more on another slide. Robin and I spend a lot of our days on IRC answering questions of people who've just installed Ardour and they can't get audio I/O out of their machine because Pulse Audio is stealing the device and it won't give it up, or they've used the wrong device or something else. People don't understand why Jack and Pulse Audio both exist. And there's certain things that we actually can't do in the kernel because of the way the kernel is. We missed out on software synthesis, generally. Yes, there's some cool synths floating around in the Linux audio world. But I mean, seriously, guys, look, Yuhi is a relatively new plug-in software company. And you look at things like Zebra 2 and how quickly that was developed. What are we doing? I mean, we don't do this well right now. Certainly not in a way that can be easily integrated into a DAW workflow. It's possible that there are some interesting synths floating around there for more prototyping type environments, but not as straightforward plugins. Even using sample libraries right now, if you go out and you want to use any of the big commercial sampling libraries, and remember it takes a lot of effort to make a good big library, that's really hard or impossible. They're in formats that we can't read, and it's changing a little bit because some of the players in that world, in the commercial world, are realizing that using standard sound font formats is a good idea. So maybe that will get better without us having to work too much at it, but it's still too hard. We also haven't really succeeded at all in N.M spatialization, by which I mean 5.1 and 10.2 and so on. And now we've got Dolby Atmos floating around in the world, and the open source world doesn't really have anything to do to offer in this area too. We have done very well in the ambisonics world. Arguably, the open source world is richer for ambisonics than the proprietary world is. But the traditional spatialization that's used for movie soundtracks and so on, not really so much. Yeah, the audio stack, well, ALSA was written in the 1990s. It was a good faith effort to improve on the open sound system drivers. But most of the people working on it, and that includes me, we didn't really know what we were doing. It's not a bad effort. We do have a very highly performant kernel, a highly performant set of drivers, but the general design of ALSA doesn't reflect any of the things that were already known just at that point in time by Apple and things that we've all learned later. Core audio is certainly my go-to comparison if you want to say, well, how should this stuff all work? If you're working on a Mac, the audio stack generally doesn't get in your way. It doesn't work sometimes, but it doesn't really it doesn't get in your way. You don't find yourself thinking, which server should I be using for this? Is this a Pulse Audio task? I don't know. You also don't have to think about Bluetooth, and is Bluetooth part of ALSA, or is Bluetooth part of Pulse Audio, and all of this kind of stuff. The weird thing is that the core audio, since it was created, has been re-engineered to work more like Jack. You don't see it, but at the heart of core audio, there's a user space server now. And your audio all goes through the user space server before it goes down to the hardware. But Apple have managed to hide all of this. So how and when do we ever get a unified user space audio stack in which everything just works and you don't have to deal with questions like, am I doing pro audio here or is this desktop audio? Because that's just a question that I face from the users of Ardour almost every single day. Some people would say, do we need it? Maybe it's okay to have that question out there. Maybe it's okay to have a stack where you do make the choice. My experience in user support says it's not okay. We have a problem in the open source world. It's not a problem, but there's a feature in the open source world, if you like, that we don't really do marketing. You look at LV2 as a plugin API, it's technically superb. It does draw on some programming concepts that most people that write plugins are not that familiar with. And the problem with it is that it didn't come into the world, an empty world. It came into a world where there were already lots of other plugin APIs, which makes it a bit harder to make a case for a new one. If you look at something like Jack, I'm not going to try to sing the praises of Jack, particularly because, as some of you know, I don't actually see them anymore. But Jack is a highly competent piece of software that did almost everything, not quite everything, did almost everything that Ableton Link did. Now you look at the adoption and the awareness of Ableton Link and since they announced it a year and a half ago, and compare that to what's happened with Jack. As far as I know, there isn't a single proprietary software company anywhere in the world that publicly admits to supporting Jack. There are some that actually do support Jack, but they don't expose it or talk to their users about it or document it. Compare it with Rewire. Rewire compared to Jack is garbage. It doesn't do half the stuff that Jack does, and most of what it does worse. But there's tons of stuff in the proprietary world that all uses Rewire. They could have been using Jack. Our license doesn't prevent it, but they don't. Why don't they do it? There's a really strongly idealistic trope among a lot of us in this room that if you build good stuff, people will come and use it, or people will be interested in it. The reality is that, at least in my experience, it doesn't actually matter that much how good what you do is. Obviously, if it's garbage, there's a problem. But Jack and LV2 are both examples that really tackle a genuine problem. LV2 even tackles a genuine problem with existing plugin APIs in the proprietary world. And they're both done really well. But people are not interested because we don't want to do marketing. We're not very good at doing marketing. We don't really see it as part of our job or our role or our interest. I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. I mean, personally, I hate the idea of being involved in marketing. But we also have to recognize if we don't, then what things that can happen are like what has just happened in the last year and a half with Jack versus Ableton Link, where Ableton Link is now getting widely implemented in lots of bits of software as a way of sharing time information. And Jack Transport, which was implemented 10 years ago, nobody even knows about it. Now, we do have Mod as an interesting example. These are a bunch of guys who are actually making a product and are actually trying to figure out how to market it and how to get it out there and have a very clear plan. And they're absolutely the exception that proves the rule. So what have we actually done in 20 years? Why even talk about we? Okay. If this was a conference to talk about, I don't know, I don't think Steinberg probably has an ASIO developers conference or something, but if it was, I don't think many people in the world would talk that much about we as a community. But this does function as a community, particularly the people who come to this conference. We all know each other to some extent. People see each other on mailing lists, and there are pull requests floating around, and there's a certain amount of sharing and interaction that goes on, between many different kinds of projects and research environments and so on. We have built a nice little ecosystem for people who know what they're doing. And it's a great ecosystem. And if you really do know what you're doing, it's probably better than anything else. And 20 years ago, we absolutely did not have that. And that's quite an accomplishment when you think about how many different things were involved in getting to that point. We had to build on the legacy of things like C-Sound, but we've also had to do all kinds of brand new stuff. And we've had to invent all kinds of new stuff. And part of what makes it great is brand new stuff like Faust. We've also highlighted along the way where we are now, there's some fundamental issues with Linux, the audio stack in particular, that we seem to have actually given up on. I think 10 years ago, one of these conferences, there would always be some talk about how are we going to fix the kernel stack. Now everybody just said, it's what it is, we may do. I'm running out of time, so let me just skip through a couple of these things. I want to talk quickly about the future. I know I'm over time. Is that all right, Albert? Can I run over quick? So the future. Most software development these days happens on the web, even if it's not really browser-based. Back in the early 90s, lots of people were dreaming of, wouldn't it be great if we had a software platform where you could just write the code once and it would run everywhere? It was called Java, which of course is actually massively used at this point, and not just by computer science departments. But browsers are turning into that. It's now becoming more and more realistic to actually write fairly sophisticated code for certain types of things. It runs on any platform that you're on, from a mobile device to some high-end desktop platform. It doesn't work very well as a desktop replacement yet, but you can already see it in the audio world where companies like Mackie and lots of others now are bringing out devices where they use the web to provide a front end for their hardware. So you have your mixer sitting in the corner, and then the PA guy wanders around the room with a tablet, and they just have a browser, possibly a remote app, but increasingly a browser that just points back at the device, and they can do everything on that. Now the web world theoretically has way more developers than the world that most of us tend to inhabit when we're at a conference like this. Obviously, some of us have day jobs that have more connections to the web, but There's loads of people out there all doing web stuff who, some of them are interested in helping with Linux audio, but it's difficult for them to do so. They don't understand anything about the way the desktop GUIs work. They don't understand anything about the way the desktop development works. You have to compile? What is that? Oh, okay, not many people actually say that, but there are some people who don't like the fact you have to do that. There's an interesting comparison to me that if you go back to the 1980s and you look at what was called application development back then, it consisted of a database and then forms and then a presentation thing. So all software development was data in a database, forms to enter it, forms to edit it, and then some way to present it, which might be tables or graphs or something. And that was really what software development was. Although the stuff that's happening on the web now looks a hell of a lot nicer than Oracle's whatever it was in 1987, if you compare what you can do on the web right now, even to GUIs on the desktop in 2000, the web is so far behind. I mean, these guys don't have any clue what complicated GUI development looks like. They're excited by having 3 widgets on the screen that you compress, and then there's animated graphic, and it's really cool, and it looks great, and for the right purpose, it's phenomenal. It's just that it's not really a way of making desktop things. So you might say, well, why go back towards the web if they have this really simple model? I think there are some ways it could be going forward. So it's just a quick sort of ARDA blurb. This is just a conceptual outline right now. Nothing's been implemented, but it's an idea that has been on my mind for almost a year now, which is people often, some companies have asked me, can we do ARDA in the browser? And I'm like, no, you cannot do ARDA in the browser. It's not happening. What you could do, though, is implement a user interface for ARDA that just uses our existing OSC control. What's the problem? You can't get OSC out of the browser to ARDA or back. So how about we implement OSC via WebSockets or WebRTC? And then your random millennial web developer, sorry if there's any of you out there, can sit down with HTML and JavaScript and CSS, and they can cook up, possibly not the full interface. I think that would be probably biting off more than anyone could chew. But you could come up with a really nice interface that controls some subset of ARDA, just like people do on Android, just like people do on a device like the Lima. It would also tend to force us to extend our OSC control possibilities in ways that would benefit everything that uses OSC. And so if this happens, and I don't see any technical reason why this can't be done, I think everyone ends up winning. We get a new set of potential developers who can work in a domain that they know and are comfortable in. Users get new front ends that are possibly more attuned to what they want to do, maybe stripped down. And we get forced to make sure that you can do everything in OSC, not just a lot of stuff. Let's skip that. Okay, on the desktop though, what's happening? Let's be realistic, there's never going to be a year of Linux on the desktop, okay? I know we've been talking about it for a long time. It's not going to happen, folks, okay? We're at 2.5% or so. That's exactly where it's going to stay for the foreseeable future. So audio is already a tiny niche in the world of technology. It doesn't raise that much money in total unless you include the systems installed in cars, which is almost entirely owned by Harman Kardon. Everything else is really small, and the Linux side of it is even tinier. I was trying to think of a good analogy to this, and much to my surprise, my sister bought a Porsche recently, very cheap. She's not wealthy, but extremely cheap. And I was thinking, well, maybe Porsche is the right model for us. And then I looked up how many they sell every year, and they sell about 200,000. It struck me, that's the model. Porsche is the entire audio technology sphere. We're the McLarens. We sell 1,700 a year. There's just like a little tiny subset within this whole thing. And I think it's worth us keeping this in mind and remembering, at least when we have our Linux-facing hats on. It doesn't matter. So McLaren is still a great company, and as far as I know, at least, they make great cars, and they have satisfied customers, and people do great things with it, have a lot of fun. But it's just a reminder that we should check our motivations for why we're attached to Linux and make sure that they're not contradicted by the recognition that we're probably, at least on the desktop, this is going to be a niche environment. I've been a little bit negative, and I'm almost done. I think I've got one more slide after this. But I don't want to be misunderstood. There is a huge amount of value in making tools that are used by small groups of people for very particular purposes. There's also value in making tools for people that make tools. You know, the tool builders are very important. They're just really different than making tools for large numbers of users who don't really know what they're doing. And that's the thing that I tend to find myself focused on these days and will be into the future. Thank you for listening. And just one last slide. Why am I wearing a suit today? I just want to remind people of these simple things, because in a way, when I look back on 20 years of doing this kind of stuff, these are things that I wish I had been remembering all the way along. Check your assumptions. Is this what hackers wear? Is this what a guy who lives in a solar power van wears? Don't rely on your initial assumptions about things. I certainly made a lot of initial assumptions when I started working in this field, and some of them were right, some of them were wrong. Don't rely on what you think you already know, because most of it's probably wrong. And finally, don't forget that there's a lot of implicit knowledge already present in the technology that we're surrounded by, and it's really important that we remember that and not try to dismiss that in our rush to be clever and new. And a suit kind of represents that. So thank you very much for listening.
I'm sure glad, Paul, that you ended on a lighter note. But maybe to cheer everyone up, Ping has arrived, thanks to Romain Michon. Romain, where are you? Back in the back. So this is the mascot, of course, of the Linux Audio Conference, for those of you who've been there for the first time. So it protects us even from the sometimes negative thoughts that Paul may have about open source and the way it's used in the world. Maybe to just kick off the Q&A, I have a remark, maybe it's also a question, but suspiciously absent from the list, your list of who do we write software for, was the entire sector of education. Of course, that's where I'm coming from. I'm from a university.
It was on a slide I skipped.
Okay, because there was some talk about the missing slide. Yeah. I think we will have a question on that, so maybe we can just postpone that for now, and I just invite you to ask questions. Maybe take a few questions from the audience, and then go to IRC and maybe back. So, who's the first one? They're so depressed.
Sorry.
So actually, I thought that your talk was pretty positive. For me, there were quite some hopeful aspects in there. So let's talk about the education thing then. Because for me, as a teacher at the university, there's this aspect of open source as something that you can learn from. Certainly very well written code, like what we use in Jack and Ardor. And when we educate young people so that they pick up these techniques, that's invaluable. Yeah. I mean, so what would be your take on this? I know that you've crossed the fence. You've taught at Berlin.
Yeah, I think
at the university, at the technical university, right?
I think there is two aspects, and one of them that you've just described well. I mean, I certainly know that for me as a programmer, one of the greatest things about open source was just actually being able to read code. Right. Being able to go in and look at insanely complicated programs at the time, like Emacs, and actually see how did they do this, and figure things out, was invaluable in terms of learning how to be a good programmer. I think there's a slightly separate question of the extent to which that's valuable for people who are interested in, say, audio or music, but don't see themselves as programmers. But what I do think is that their ability to build prototypes quickly, and interesting things quickly, which is not just a feature of the open source world, it's a feature of how audio software is developed, makes it very simple to create interesting environments, interesting projects, interesting demonstrations for students. And the fact that those things are then accessible to them playing with them in a deeper way.
Well, and maybe they will use that later on.
Yeah, absolutely.
In their jobs.
I also think that, you know, things, it's odd to cite the web as an example of open source, because in some ways it isn't, but one of the features of the web which is less true these days because of the widespread, spread of JavaScript and so on. But the web is an interesting case of open source too. And you look at educational stuff that happens on the web, figuring out how that's all done is almost a given. Students can go in and actually read how this browser-based environment works. And so I think that adds a complement to what happens in the compiled open source world, and offers another rich area where people will be able to do very interesting things for students, with students, and then have the students be able to take it on and say, well, let's extend this, let's modify it, and let's see what happens. And even if that starts happening more on the web than it does with compiled environments, I think that's still a win that comes from an open source mindset.
Okay, so any remarks on that? Other questions? Up there.
So not really a remark, Paul, but I think one of the earlier conferences, like 9 years ago or so, we kind of agreed on after your presentation that we were feeling like 100 guys, we are the center of the Linux audio world, and we are feeling like we have quite some influence. In the end, we agreed that we are still, as you said, that Linux niche inside the audio niche, which is still tiny. I still wonder, from today's perspective, and I know you're massively biased, but do you see and realize that from feedback from new users of art or from new people who have maybe given you feedback, is the amount of people increasing? So do you see a trend upwards, like counterfeiting the Linux on the desktop trend, which is more or less stable? And do you think that it is getting in the right direction, or is it rather stable or stale for you?
It's a tricky question to answer because there's a question of how many people are using Linux as a platform at this current point in time versus, so I mean there are people coming in and leaving the environment all the time, and there's a flux. And the number of machines, so the only actual metrics we have, for example, that count how many people have run this on Linux, and let's say how many people, specifically we count how many people have used it on Linux from the same IP address at least 3 times. So there's some semblance that they didn't just start at once. Obviously that number keeps growing, but I'm not measuring the rate ever. So it could be that all those, the people that we were counting 6 years ago don't do it anymore. I would say the general impression I get is that the situation is getting a little better, so that it is slightly easier for people to just get Linux and just start doing audio now. And so there are less people who will try it and they'll be completely confused about what to do and they'll abandon the platform for that purpose. On the other hand, if you go by the metric that I know some people were throwing around in the 90s, that for every 1 complaint that you get, there are 10 people that had the same issue and didn't complain, and you look at our IRC channel, the situation's still pretty bad. There's still lots and lots of people who want to try the platform out and immediately find they can't make head or tail of it. So I don't really know the answer on the numbers, and the actual situation, it still seems to me to be not great. I would feel very nervous at this point about I feel very comfortable throwing anyone onto Linux, but if they tell me that they're planning to do audio on Linux, I get nervous.
Okay, one more question over here.
Hi. First, thanks a lot for all you're doing. That's awesome. I was wondering about your experience you might have with other solution, proprietary solution, and in what way that's influenced the direction hardware is taking.
I think the only thing that really influences me from the proprietary world is probably Ableton. I'm somewhat good friends with one of the founders of Ableton. Ironically, they started almost exactly the same time that I did. It was a PhD thesis. So for all of you out there, you're working on audio PhD thesis, 10 years from now, you could employ 200 people and have cool offices in Berlin. I found Ableton right from the beginning to be a really interesting piece of software, and I'm interested in their reconception of the creative workflow and what it means to try to make music, and how they moved away from, somebody's going to play an instrument and we're going to record it and then do stuff. At this point in time, though, it's had almost no real impact on ARDA itself. I mean, there's some development that is vaguely inspired by the idea, but there's nothing in the program. And the other door makers, generally, the way I think about the world of digital audio workstations as a whole is it's a commodity at this point. Everybody knows what they have to do. They have to do 99 or 98% of that list, and if they do, you could pick one of a dozen programs and they're all going to work for you. You might prefer the colors in that one, or you might prefer something else. And so in general, I don't tend to look at the other DAWs and say, well, what are they up to, or what are they doing, or what direction are they going in, unless something really brand new comes along. And I think that the last time I think that happened was when, you know, Elastic Time or Time Stretch started showing up in the middle 2000s, I guess, following Ableton's lead in that. So I don't tend to watch them a lot. I do think, as I say, I think a company like Ableton has had an interesting new take, and I hope that we see more stuff, maybe in ARDA, maybe in the ecology as a whole, that will reflect that kind of workflow. I don't take questions from you.
Just got a remark, email from a guy called Richard, and he said, like, you should mention it's called GNU Linux. And
that's true.
No, it's an email. And also, if you make a distinction between open source that you mention all the time, to free software, or if you just use the term interchangeable.
I use the terms interchangeably. I am not hugely interested in the distinction at this point, but my personal commitment is to Libre software, not open source or free software. No, I said my personal focus is on the free or Libre aspects of it. The open source, for some reason, is slightly easier to say, and it's slightly more of a widely used buzzword, but if I could remember to say it all the time, I would say free software or Libre software.
Oh, it's the Libre audio conference, actually.
Yeah. Right.
I'm one of the people that finds the ARDA interface extremely confusing and almost frightening. Mm-hmm. With that in mind, I was particularly interested in you talking about possible web access, because are you thinking in terms of, you sort of hinted at maybe cut down interface where you could access the major features without having to dive right into it?
Yeah, that's pretty much precisely the idea if that goes forward. What would be represented would be up to whatever web developer chose to try to do that. I mean, I certainly don't have plans to try to make a new interface. I don't know anybody else who's involved in the core development group who would bother to do that. But what I also have in mind is that you could easily have multiple different ones of those very easily and very cheaply. It's just I hate phrases like web app, but it's just a web app. It's just a website that you could try, and somebody might make one that is literally just for recording one mic and one line level instrument, and nothing else. Or somebody might make something that's 50% of the interface. So that's very much the idea of what it would enable.
All right. A very short remark after thanking you for all your work and contributions to the Linux Audio. Very short. I'm not sure if this got addressed or stressed enough, but I think the Linux Audio open source way of doing things is very important for education, because I use open source only in all my classes, and it's very useful for other people to learn from it, so they can open it and they can see what's going on inside. And I think that's of crucial importance for understanding software.
Just as a follow-up to that, one thing I would say is that when I originally started working on ARDA, I hope it's obvious, I never had any idea that it would be anywhere near as successful as it has been. And one of I partly wanted to have something a bit like Pro Tools for myself, but the other reason was that I wanted to, if you looked at the software world at that point, if you wanted to know how to write a text editor or a compiler, there were lots and lots of examples, and you could go, or a web browser, and you could go read them and figure out how they did things. If you wanted to understand how a digital audio workstation worked, what were you going to look at? Jazz++? I mean, so part of my goal of ARDA originally, and even to some extent to this day, was to write, if nothing else, just one example of how it could be done. I mean, we now have lots. We have Qtractor, we have Non, we have several other examples where people could go look at and see how is this done, in just the same way as I was doing in the early 1980s of reading Emacs code to figure out, you know, how do you do a text editor. Maybe that's a bad example. But anyway, that idea of people being able to look in and learn from what's done, even if they don't use it or decide it's garbage. I mean, I'd be entirely happy to have some younger developer take a look inside Ardour and just be like, why did they do this? This is ridiculous. It's so stupid, because they've got a much better idea. But at least we gave them some initial idea of sort of what kinds of things you need to do.
Paul, maybe 1 or 2 questions from IRC?
All right, so people were really anxious about the missing slide or the are we all wrong? So I don't know if you can talk about that.
The all wrong thing actually was, I touched on it very slightly at the end when I talked about 1980s application development, which was all this database-centric stuff. Lots of people in this room, I suspect, and I know myself in particular, really love this type of programming because it's absolutely nothing like any of that horrible stuff. It's not a database, and you don't have forms, and users don't just tap data in and then some manager, looks at it or something. And I certainly feel very grateful to have escaped from that notion of what escaped. I was never in it, thankfully, but I never had to deal with that version of what software was about. When I look at what's happening on the web now, just last week or the beginning of this week, I was at I guess a web startup in London, and wandering around looking at what they're all doing, and it keeps occurring to me that modern web application development is almost exactly the same thing again. There's a database, and people enter data, and then there's some way of visualizing it, and a lot of web application stuff now is all based around the same model, even if it looks much nicer. And I think a lot of us feel like, oh, it's great, we don't have to do that kind of development. We get to do creative software, we make noises and videos and all this cool stuff. And I find myself wondering, what would happen if we all made a huge mistake? And really, we should all be developing this kind of software in the same way that the old 1980s version and the web version says. What they say about software is that software is about data, entering data and manipulating data. And really, that's what all of our stuff does as well. But we don't develop it with that as a clear central model. And I don't think there's any software in the Libre audio software world. I suspect there might not be anywhere in the audio software world that actually takes that stance on what is being done. And I'm really happy that I don't do it that way, but it does occur to me that we might have made a big mistake. And possibly we would have much better architectures in general that were much more flexible and much more open to new interfaces and new ways of manipulating data if we had just said, look, take a database and there's ways to put it in and ways to present it and leave it at that. So that was the are we all wrong?
Yes, I think we need to wrap it up because we're getting close to lunchtime, but one more question was over there. Maybe just a short one.
Regarding user numbers of Ardour, I think subscriptions increased quite a lot the last 2 years, right? So is that
Windows?
What?
Windows.
So that's Windows. Okay. Thanks.
Paul, you made a distinction between developing features and polishing, saying that companies do a lot of polishing. So I'm wondering, in Ardour, how much energy is devoted to polishing currently?
I think it depends on who you talk to, I guess. For myself, I guess I would just say I wish I was doing more feature development right now. There's a third thing, which is I'm not going to say that word, refactoring or redesigning internal architecture. And I seem to spend more of my time doing that than I would like. And then there's polishing or bug fixing or some combination of the two. Robin may have a different take. I mean, he puts in at least as much work as I do. I don't know how much he feels he's polishing versus features, but
right now, more polishing.
Yeah. So yeah, more from him too. It would be. I'd really love to actually get back to doing features. And there's a thin line, right? Sometimes it's like, making a slightly better way to do an operation looks like a new feature, but really you're just polishing it up. Yeah, well, I mean, we've probably moved towards polishing more now, but it's such a huge project that unlike the ZPlane thing, where they're just tweaking, you know, the finest details of time stretching, we've just got this behemoth code base. How do you polish an elephant? You know, it's tricky.
So, thank you very much, Paul. I think we have to wrap it up at this point, but let's give a hearty applause.